Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.
We welcome you to a brand new series of roundtable discussions on another of our standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Our topic for the next several weeks will be the Doctrine Covenants, this unparalleled set of revelations given largely to the prophet Joseph Smith. Joining us for our discussion this hour and in the coming weeks are some brand new faces to our roundtable discussion series. New faces to the program, but certainly not new faces to Brigham Young University or to many of you viewers. Joining me across the table are Professor Matthew Richardson of the Department of Church History and Doctrine. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you.
Professor Richard O. Cowan, longtime member of the Department of Church History and Doctrine. Richard, thanks for joining us.
It's good to be here.
Professor Susan Easton Black, also of the Department of Church History and Doctrine. Thank you for joining us, Susan. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I'm Andrew Skinner, Dean of Religious Education at Brigham Young University. Well, I am quite excited about the opportunity to discuss the Doctrine and Covenants. In one sense, to me, the Doctrine and Covenants is a tangible symbol of the living Lord that we worship and whose name is incorporated into the church that we belong to. I thought that maybe to get us going today, since this is our first discussion in this new series, I could begin by asking you, the experts, a series of basic questions and then just have you respond. I know, as our viewers probably know, that you have devoted a lifetime to the study of the Doctrine and Covenants, so we're so grateful to have you here. What is the Doctrine and Covenants? I think most everybody knows the answer to that question, but there may be some that do not. What is the Doctrine and Covenants? Why is it unique among our standard works? Why should we be excited about the opportunity to study the Doctrine and Covenants? What kinds of revelations are incorporated into the pages of the Doctrine and Covenants? It seems to me the Doctrine and Covenants isn't a monotone, but we have lots of different kinds or genres even of revelations that have been collected. So let me just throw those out and maybe Matt ask you to respond to the question, what's the Doctrine and Covenants?
It's a great question. As a matter of fact, in the introduction of the Doctrine and Covenants, which unfortunately is often overlooked, some people, when they start out, they won't even look at the introduction. They'll jump right into the text. But there's a little sentence here that says, on the second page, these sacred revelations were received in answer to prayer in the times of need and came out of real-life situations involving real people. And I've always liked that. When one looks at the Doctrine and Covenants, it's not meant to be a sterile sense of doctrinal gatherings of just okay, here we go through like a catechism of say here's the points that one must memorize, but they are revelatory experiences for real circumstances and real people that extend well beyond the time when they were given. I think that that's an important aspect of...
Leaders of the church had questions about the way that the Savior's church was to be organized, how it was to function. They needed divine help, they needed inspiration, they received it. Those revelations written down, then gathered together, form what we call the Doctrine and Covenants.
And not even just leaders of the church, also lay members or investigators of the church. Individuals who catch a spirit of what is taking place and will come to the prophet Joseph and say, what can I do? What should I do? What would the Lord have of me? And then, bless his heart, Joseph would ask, and revelation come to bless the life of those individuals. And so it's not always organizational, but it's practical, real life that really sends a message to saints today in the same tone. What would the Lord have of me?
Richard, what's your perspective on why the Doctrine and Covenants is unique among our standard works?
Well, as Matt was just saying, it's a collection of revelations. You find the same statement on the title page of the Doctrine and Covenants. I contrast it with the Book of Mormon, for example, where the story, this wonderful motivating story, is blended with the doctrinal teachings, and therefore the background of the teachings is right there. Now, in the case of the Doctrine and Covenants, this collection of revelations needs to have the storyline added, the church history storyline, to give full meaning. So that's one way in which it's unique. But I think that even more significantly, I think of the New Testament was written primarily to people who were members of the church, to motivate them, reprove them, as the case might have been. But in the case of the Doctrine and Covenants, it was given at a time when the truth had been lost for centuries and needed to be restored. And so we find in the Doctrine and Covenants perhaps the clearest statement of various gospel doctrines as well as organizational principles. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. You just touched on something that really struck a responsive chord with me. If you use the New Testament as an example, New Testament first composed in a language other than English, composed maybe, we don't know, but some books maybe in Aramaic, certainly all of the books in Greek. Old Testament first composed in Hebrew, sections of the Pearl of Great Price, Book of Moses, and so on, ancient languages. The Doctrine and Covenants is unique in that it is our only volume of the standard works that was revealed in the first instance in the English language. It was revealed in the language of Joseph Smith, which was, his mother tongue was the English language. And so there's no opportunity, if you will, for mistranslation. This came straight from the Lord to the Lord's prophet. And I think that makes it an incredible book, an exciting book of Scripture to look at. You were going to say something, Susan.
Okay, I agree. The Doctrine and Covenants is one of my most favorite. I'm going to pick up on what Matt did. This introduction section will tell us what the Doctrine and Covenants is, and just even the first line. The Doctrine and Covenants is a collection of divine revelations and inspired declarations given for the establishment and regulation of the kingdom of God on the earth in the last days. And I will be forever grateful for Joseph Smith to be such a pure vessel that the Lord could speak through him. And as we talked about the different individuals, there are 136 individuals mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants. And we can trace their lives. They were real. We know they lived on the earth. We can talk about families, even their wealth, where they're moving. And to be able to know that much about the people mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants and to see how the Doctrine and Covenants is efficacious today.
Well, look at you touched on something I think is significant there too. Look at the close historical proximity to our own time. We're not talking about people who lived 10,000 miles away 3,000 years ago. We're talking about people who were separated from us by only 1,000 or 2,000 miles who lived what? A century ago or a century and a half ago. Mm-hmm. That makes it significant
and
too.
Many of their descendants today are in the church. They have their journals, their pictures. They knew what they thought and felt, and they, like their ancestors of old, have maintained their testimony.
And many of today's readers don't live 1,000 miles away. They live in the same places.
Right.
That's a great point. That's absolutely right.
So there's relatively fresh voices throughout this whole text. And one thing that keeps coming back, Susan mentioned the Lord spoke, and you talked about the living Lord. I remember a student coming to me one time and almost embarrassed to admit that he had fallen in love with the Doctrine and Covenants, as if this was second-hand scripture and he wasn't supposed to love it. And he asked me, why is that, Brother Richardson? Why does this speak to me? And then in his own musing, he said, maybe it's because I am hearing and reading the voice of the living Lord.
That's exactly
yes.
right. That's exactly right. we get through the prophet Joseph Smith exact quotations from the Lord as He spoke them. Right. It's not filtered through the lens of another language, through translators, through a dictionary. You know, most of us have to begin to learn Greek or Hebrew by looking at a dictionary. We get the Lord's direct quotations on the pages of the Doctrine and Covenants speaking to us. I heard an interesting thing. I wonder how you would respond to this. One of the ways we can get a lot out of the sections of the Doctrine and Covenants is by substituting our name for the names of the individuals that are mentioned in the text. Is there any merit to that? Do you ever do that?
Sometimes. I think there's times where I find myself a lot like Martin Harris, even though I might not want to admit it. But at a time where I might be looking for something to shore up my own faith and find similarities with myself and my own circumstances with Martin, then to read the voice of the Lord at the time to Martin Harris, but it is just as powerful and just as clear to me in that situation. Yeah. And insert a name, and I think that there is power in that.
I think so. I think the Lord tells us to liken the Scriptures unto ourselves. However, there might be a caution. There was a time when I had an occasion to ask over 200 returned missionaries who was the Section 4 of the Doctrine and Covenants given to. And some people said it's given to Joseph Smith. Others said, no, it's Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris. One said Hugh Nibley. And some said, well, it was given to my bishop, my mission president. And I think it's important for us to remember those that lived in the past. As much as we liken it unto ourselves, to remember the greatness in the case of Section 4 of Joseph Smith Sr., and that he was a wheat farmer, and that he was prepared to move from that to accept the gospel.
Well, sometimes you have to know something about the people in the past to know how the message related to them, so that we can then better understand how it would relate to us.
Well, in fact, let's move in a slightly different direction. Susan, can you talk to us a little bit about the historical context of Joseph Smith's times? Many, if not most, of the Revelation, a few sections were not given directly to the prophet Joseph, but most of them were. Give us a sense of what it was like as the revelations were being given to the prophet and what was happening both in and out of the church.
Okay, for the church at that time, the church is established in the United States. And so by the time we're looking at the revelations he's receiving, and we look Doctrine and Covenants, we start 1823, which puts him in Manchester, Palmyra area of New York. And we can carry through the Doctrine and Covenants, well, with the official declarations up to 1978. So that puts us through a lot of different presidents of the United States. It puts us through the Andrew Jackson time, the press to Manifest Destiny, the United States going all the way towards California. But in Joseph's time, we're looking at a church that's pushing against the western frontier. They're moving from western New York to the Western Reserve, we now call Ohio, and from there to Missouri and then Illinois. And so as we look at the time period, most of those that were joining the church early were from the eastern states, some eventually south, middle states, and finally the English saints coming in during his time. So it's a collective time period, but it's a time in which people in the United States, they're searching.
Joseph Smith, born in 1805, the days of Thomas Jefferson, of Napoleon, of Andrew Jackson, and then moving ahead to the movement westward, and ultimately concluding with well, as you say, the declaration on the priesthood. So I think that's helpful to give us some perspective that, as you mentioned, these are real, live people, and they read newspapers and just like we do, and they were experiencing their spiritual lives along with politics that were unfolding and all other kinds of life's experiences.
There's an interesting statement that you ended on. They were searching, and as you were mentioning that they are real-life people looking for real-life answers, and there seemed to be an awakening at that time period, at least looking for something. And which brings us to the notion of even gathering the revelations for the Doctrine and Covenants. Joseph said that there was a great anxiety amongst the people to lay hold of these revelations, to have them, people memorizing them, doing anything they can to have bits and pieces, almost like, please give me more, I'd like to have more. Joseph, is there anything else? And as a result, in that search, there is a grand desire to have some sense of the revelations, not just in oral form, but the revelations in a form by which that they can read and find answers to their questions.
Don't you find yourselves in the same situation, though, wanting to know everything that our dear prophet has to say, wanting to get his perspective on events, not just going on in the world, but things that affect us spiritually and ecclesiastically? I can really put myself, I think, in the place of these early saints and that yearning, that desire. I mean, we've got a living prophet on the earth for the first time in centuries and centuries. Why not, want to take advantage of that?
I think maybe it's how we feel when General Conference gets close.
I agree. I think that's exactly
we
right.
want to be able to hear. It's how we feel when the ensign's coming. For those that take church news, it's the excitement.
And we can't even wait for them now to come online, and that's just a couple of days after conference. It used to be we had to wait for the ensign, and now I'll have even students that will come and say, oh, why does it take so long to get the text back? And they just heard it 2 days ago. 2 days ago. It's a great thing to search for that truth.
See, in Joseph Smith's day, people wanted to have a copy, not just to hear it and so on, but to have a copy that they could then ponder and review and understand more fully.
And one of my favorite stories is Orson Pratt, where he had access to some of the writings of the Revelation, where he said that he would stay up at night and they would rehearse it back and forth, trying to memorize it so that when they went back into the mission field, they would have a copy, even though it was a memorized copy, a copy of those revelations, whether it be written, which does bring to a problem of eventually where we're going to have to say we better get a standard here of what's happening and bring back in all of the variations of that, which is important.
And how does that particular experience bless the church years and years later when Orson Pratt is the one involved in dividing things up into, sections and double columns and all of that sort of thing? So even that seemingly, I don't want to say inconsequential exercise had a great benefit to the church years after he had experienced it.
It's true.
Richard, give us some sense of the history of the Doctrine and Covenants itself. Tell us kind of from the earliest beginnings, how the revelations came together, how they were first printed, the editions that it went through, and so on.
I was just thinking that as you're talking about the setting for the revelations, the organization of the church itself was a setting that, as you look at today's Doctrine and Covenants, about 1/3 of all the revelations were given just during a single year, 1831, which is the year, of course, after the church was organized. And right from the beginning, there was an interest in collecting the revelations. In the summer of 1830, Doctrine and Covenants section 24 directed the prophet to begin writing and compiling, and he did. And as the first conference of the church met in June of 1830, 2 of the revelations were accepted as the Articles and Covenants of the church, and were then used by missionaries and quoted by the saints quite frequently. But then it was the following year, in 1831, when this desire that Matt mentioned of the people wanting the revelations, I guess, mounted to the point that a conference convened and the decision was made, yes, we will, in fact, publish several thousand copies of these revelations. And the work was to be done not in Ohio, where the conference was held or where most of the saints lived, but out in Missouri, where the church had a press. And so I guess the first step was to select, and interesting to know that not all the revelations that had been received were included, but the first presidency, or leaders of the church, I guess there was no first presidency yet, Joseph and his close associates prayerfully considered the revelations to include, and most of the basic doctrinal or organizational revelations, of course, were included, plus a selection of other personal ones, I guess, to illustrate the kinds of things that the Lord had given direction on. Well, the work of printing was going forward in Missouri until the summer of 1833, when a mob, upset at some of the editorials in the Latter-day Saint newspaper being issued from that same press, came and destroyed the press. And the work was not completed. Let me show you how they were printing. They printed the material on large sheets such as this. Now forget the fact that this one is folded. You'll see why in just a second. But it was a large page, but they knew that it would ultimately be folded in a certain way. And so in the original printing, they had some pages that would look upside down or right side up, but they knew exactly where they would fit, because it would be folded in a very precise way, such as this, and this would be called a signature. And apparently 5 of these signatures had been printed. And you see, the next step would be when you're binding, after the book is bound, these would be sewn to the spine. Then these other sides would be trimmed off. And maybe that's why sometimes you get a book from the bookstore that a couple of the pages are stuck together, because the cutting didn't quite catch it. But anyway, the material that was included in these first 5 signatures went up through what we now know as Doctrine and Covenants 64. In fact, maybe you'd like to turn to section 64, verse 36. And I'm just wondering if I could ask one of you to read just the last phrase in this little volume is reproduction of the Book of Commandments. That was the outcome of this initial printing. We'll come back to that in a second. When I first saw this little Book of Commandments, I thought, it looks like a complete book. And I thought it was interrupted with the mob. But now as you follow along in verse 36, just note where Susan's reading ends.
Okay. For verily I say that the rebellious are not of the blood of Ephraim.
Now, is that the end of the verse?
Wherefore they shall be plucked out is the end of the verse.
Yeah, it's too bad the mob didn't see that. But my guess is that there would have been a 6th signature like this that would have included the rest of that revelation. And then, of course, section 133 had been given by the Lord at the conference where the decision was made to print, and that would be the appendix, so that probably would have been included. And then what we know as section 68, which the Lord said is in addition to the covenants and commandments, which is a common way the early saints refer to the revelations. So those things would have likely been included, perhaps others, and I don't know for sure. But to make a, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, at what point were the lectures on faith bound with the revelations?
Well, what happened is when the mob destroyed the press, some very valiant saints, including a couple of teenage girls, ran out and at great personal risk gathered up these large sheets that they had seen, and people went and had them bound. And so some of the books might look something like this, others with different bindings, but that was only, Susan, you and I were looking at this, only revelations through the middle of 1831.
Yeah, it's just 31.
Yeah. Wow.
And so they decided to not simply reprint this compilation, but now it's 1833. Let's look at what other revelations might be included. So the decision was to print an enlarged collection. And that work was nearing completion in 1835. And in the recent months, there had been a series of lectures that we call the Lectures on Faith, had been given in the School of the Prophets. And just as people yearn to have copies of the Revelations, there is a demand for copies of these lectures. And so the decision in 1835 was, let's, as we're binding the Revelations, let's bind the Lectures on Faith. Now, I don't think at that time they were thinking anything about standard work or canon, meaning an official list. So they just said, well, just for convenience, let's bind them together. Well, as this book was put together, and you can see it's a little bit larger. Let me just show you the other for comparison. This is the Book of Commandments. Now, the new one in 1835 is bigger. The first part of it was called Setting Forth the Doctrine of the Church, which was the Lectures on Faith. And then about 70 pages in, the second part, the Covenants, meaning the Revelation. So call it Doctrine and Covenants.
And the Lectures on Faith were bound with the Doctrine and Covenants or with the Revelations until 1921, at which time a change was made.
Yes. And that's when they removed those.
And that's when they removed those.
But even though historically the doctrine part is gone, the Revelation certainly contain doctrine, so the title is still very descriptive.
It might be profitable to point out that the Doctrine and Covenants is not a monotone. There are many different kinds of revelations that were incorporated into the Doctrine and Covenants. We have revelations to individuals, to the elders, to the church. We have visions, such as Section 76. We have answers to questions, Section 77. We have letters, Section 128, 129, meetings, minutes of meetings, prophecies, historical accounts, and so on.
It's exciting.
It really, truly is exciting. Our time is spent. Maybe I can just bring this part of our discussion to a close by reading to you a statement by President Wilford Woodruff, who said the following: "I consider that the Doctrine and Covenants, our testament, contains a code of the most solemn, most godlike proclamations ever made to the human family." As Susan said before, how blessed we are to have these revelations through the prophet Joseph Smith. Thank you for a very enlivening discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Visit our website to find out more about the Doctrine and Covenants. Go to byubroadcasting.org. Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.